Just out for a walk, and I spotted this in a hedge. This leaf here is hops. And in fact, that shoot there is what they call a hop top. And this shoot here, this young shoot of hops, probably from about there, where it just snaps off nice and cleanly, is edible. So we're going to pick some hop tops today and take them home and see what we can make with them. Now it's only really worth picking these in spring, and it's only worth picking the very end that comes away very easily, just snaps away like this. So I'm just finding the point where it snaps. Now hops are found in hedgerows quite a lot, often as a kind of remnant of medieval brewing, but they've often been in the hedgerows there, just surviving, just rooting themselves along for centuries perhaps. And later on these will produce, or at least the female plants will produce, hops that could be used in beer. Perhaps not as good quality as the hops that have been bred specifically for that purpose. The modern varieties have got a lot more of the flavour chemicals in them, but these wild hops here, if they produce any actual hops, I may come back here and pick some and try and brew my own beer. It's important to avoid picking things that are not hops. This here is, I can't remember whether this is white bryony or black bryony. I will put it on the screen. It's a relative of cucumbers. It's the only native plant that we have in the cucumber family. I can't remember which bryony it is. I think it might be white bryony, but can't remember. Anyway, but this is toxic and you wouldn't want to eat that. It looks quite similar, but it's got tendrils, it's got different shaped leaves. It feels different. So this is a hop vine here. This has got a kind of Velcro feel to the stems. Other hook and loop fastener products are available. So here we can see the hop vines are busy going up last year's hop vines. They're climbing up the dead vines there. Now it won't do the hop vines any harm at all for me to just pick these young shoots like this. There are little buds in every one of these nodes on the stem. So when I pick out the top here like this, I'm not going to really set the plant back at all. It'll just bush out from the next node down. It'll produce a new shoot from there and it'll carry on up the tree. Now people do compare these hop shoots to asparagus, and they talk about eating them steamed like asparagus. I've done that in the past. It's okay, but as I say, the vines have this kind of Velcro deal going on to them, which is they've got sort of backward pointing little bristles on them, and those persist through cooking. And so even when you've cooked them, they're still just a little bit kind of bristly and they stick to stuff. And so it's not desperately unpleasant, but it's not the nicest eating experience in my particular view. But it is a good vegetable. So we're going to pick a load of these. We've got quite a few in the basket already. Look at that. Going to pick a load of these, and I think we'll try and put them in something. Got some hop tops in the basket there. Got to have something else to go in my lunch today. Eva, come on this way. So this is a very typical sort of hedgerow type of place here. So we've got cow parsley, that's the thing with white flowers here. We've got hogweed, that's the thing with the big broad leaves there. We've got nettles, stinging nettles, very tasty, and I do like eating them, but I want to go for something else. We've got white dead nettle behind there, which is not related to stinging nettles, but looks very similar, except for the white flowers. It's not closely related at all, but it's a really close look-alike for stinging nettles. Also edible, although quite a strong flavour, that one. But anyway, I'm going to have a wander along here. There's some comfrey there with these white nodding sort of bell-shaped flowers. Comfrey's quite an interesting one because it used to be considered very edible. It's now kind of disadvised, I think because there's saponins or something like that in it. But anyway, that's comfrey. You quite often see it with purple flowers or pink flowers, sometimes lovely sort of marbled pink and purple and white flowers. Anyway, so we're going to wander along this little hedgerow here and see what else we can find. So here's a plant we could use. This is common sorrel. Sorrel is related to dock. and it has these leaves that are kind of spear shaped with little kind of backward pointing spurs on them, except it's obvious something else has been eating this sorrel here. There are probably still some bits, the tips and so on, that I could pick, but I think we'll just look along and see if we can find a better example of it. So here's a much nicer example of sorrel, and you can see we've got some lovely intact leaves there. Now these arrow shaped leaves, so you've got a pointy leaf with little spiky bits that stick backwards towards the stem, and you can see that there. There is another plant that has leaves that shape that you really mustn't eat, and that's wild arum. It's very different from this, but I suppose if you were completely inexperienced and you saw these arrow shaped leaves like this and you had no sense of scale, maybe if you'd only seen it in a video for example, then you might pick the wrong thing. So we'll have a look at wild arum in a minute. It's very different to this plant. It's a much more robust leaf, much more robust plant, and critically nothing like sorrel, because sorrel produces this tall stem with leaves that branch off of it. Wild arum, you'll see, doesn't have this tall stem with branching leaves. What are you eating? Grass. Okay, I'm going to pick some sorrel leaves from a bit further in the hedge here. But there we go, there's a really nice leaf of sorrel. And sorrel has a kind of flavour that some people have likened to green apples or lemons. It's a slightly acidic flavour, and that acidity does come in part from oxalic acid, which can be a problem if you've got kidney issues, or if you have a problem with absorbing calcium. This will tend to lock up calcium when you eat it, so it's not a thing to eat all the time. It's a really nice flavour, not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. So I'm not going to pick a ton of that. I will pick enough just to give it a flavour in the dish I'm going to make, and most of it's going to be the hop tops. So this down here is wild arum. So this has got similar shaped leaves to sorrel, much bigger, much more robust, nearly always held horizontally. That is the flower of the wild arum. But anyway, wild arum, the leaves all come up on stalks from a kind of central crown that's at ground level. So wild arum, you would not want to pick that. It's toxic. It probably isn't deadly because it would kind of cause blistering to your mouth before you ate enough of it to do you very much harm, but it's definitely a plant you don't want to eat. I did mean to say actually that with sorrel the entire plant is edible. So these seed heads here, these are flower heads actually, they haven't opened yet. Those are quite edible, so we'll pick a couple of those. I'm not going to pick them all because, you know, this plant's got to reproduce and do its thing, but I'll pick a couple of those since they are much of a theme with the hop tops. So here's some more common sorrel growing in brighter sunlight, so the leaves are a darker green. We'll have a few of those leaves. I will just pick the little inflorescence there, the nice stem. We'll leave that one, but I will have that nice leaf there. And it's probably the inflorescences like this that you will find before the leaves with sorrel. So when they're a bit more mature, they turn red like that. Sheep sorrel, which is a related species, you'll find it growing in lawns and grass, and often you'll just see this kind of swathe of red first. But anyway, just a few bits of that. There's loads of it here, and so I am only going to pick some of it because it's very important. Look at that bee. We'll get back to what's important in a minute when we've had a look at this bee. Right, it's very important when you're foraging not to pick all of anything. So we've got to be responsible as foragers. We are taking something from nature, and so it's our responsibility to understand that there needs to be enough of it left when we're finished. So, okay, that's the sermon done. No more preaching after that. Oh look, there's a brown marmorated stink bug there. More about that in a moment. Let's get that all back to Shrimp HQ and see what we can do with it. So, been out and picked these lovely hop tops and a little bit of sorrel. What are we going to do with it? I think I'm going to make a quiche stuffed with hop tops. Kind of like an asparagus quiche, but with hops. So I'm just going to give those a little soak and a rinse while I talk about the quiche pastry. I've prepared a pastry case that I've lightly blind baked. This was just a short crust pastry made with 200 grams of plain flour, 100 grams of salted butter, a little grind of black pepper in the food processor and just whiz that round until it looks like breadcrumbs. Then add cold water, running the food processor until it just comes together into a dough. Then I rolled that out nice and thin, lined the case and put it in the fridge for half an hour. Quite a lot of offcuts from that pastry, so we won't let those go to waste. I'm going to make some cheese straws. So I just gathered it together, rolled it out, grated some cheese on top, folded it, rolled it again, grated some more cheese, just repeated that several times, a little bit of dried herbs in there as well, and then chopped that into little fingers, and then that goes in the oven while it's coming up to temperature for blind baking my pastry case. And then when those come out, even though there was no leavening at all in that dough, the steam that's puffed up and pushed apart those laminated thin layers of pastry. Those cheese straws are delicious just as a snack, but they're also fantastic with soup or something like that. So there's my blind baked pastry case. That was only in for about 12 minutes and it's very, very lightly cooked, but that's fine because it's going to get cooked again. Those hop tops, I gave them a little soak in some water because being quite kind of bristly, they do tend to pick up a little bit of dust on dry days. So I gave them a soak to loosen that, and then we'll just give them a rinse off. And then I'm just going to lightly steam those. I'm going to kind of poach them, I suppose. Tiny little bit of butter in a frying pan. Okay, that butter is bubbling away nicely. I might even let that brown a little bit because the flavour will just help. Okay, so that's nice and warm. And then I've got my hop tops and my sorrel tops straight in there. Like that. And I'll cover them up with a lid. I didn't dry them off or anything, I just drained them. They're now going to steam a little bit in the water that was on them. I will just move them about a little bit just to make sure that they all get evenly dealt with. Okay, and you can see that they're starting to go a little bit tender, but still nice and fresh and green. I suspect they will go dark green when we cook them in the quiche. Right, that's had long enough. So heat off, and we'll get them out onto a cold plate so that they don't continue overcooking. There we go. Right, that's fine. I'll just set that aside and let the steam leave them now. My sorrel leaves looking a tiny little bit wilted and sad, but that doesn't really matter. I've given them a quick rinse and we'll just shred these into little ribbons. And that's just going to go across the bottom of the pastry case just to get us a flavour of sorrel into the whole of the quiche. So I need to prepare a bit of filling, but first I think we'll put some grated cheese in there. Like that. I think 2 eggs will be enough. Little pinch of salt. Salt will help to loosen the eggs up and will enable me to beat this to a more uniform consistency. Interestingly, some people say the exact opposite. But usually the people that say the exact opposite are just repeating something some famous chef said. Little splash of milk. So pastry case is back. Now we're going to have those hop tops in there. I was going to try and swirl them artistically, but I don't think that's actually going to happen. Now my egg mixture over the top. Oh, I think maybe 1 more egg might do actually. I thought maybe 3 eggs was going to be overkill, but it seems like... Okay, so my 3rd egg is going to go on top there, like that. Yeah, that looks about right. Finish that off with some more grated cheese. Good. So that needs to go into the oven now. It'll be gas mark 5 or whatever that is equivalent to right here. And 25 minutes maybe, but I'll keep an eye on it because they tend to cook from the outside in. And so it'll puff up. And once it's puffed up all the way to the middle, it's done. Right, well there it is. Hop top quiche. Now, I was thinking I might have liked a little bit more golden toasting on the top, but actually I think that's okay. I think any more toasting on the top would come at the expense of burnt crust. Now, that's got to cool down a little bit before I can serve it, which I'm just going to do with a salad and some tomatoes, I think. Okay, the quiche has had a chance to cool down a little bit now, so time to get it plated up. So nothing especially fancy. A wedge of this quiche. Okay, looks pretty good. And a kind of Waldorf adjacent salad. Let's go and give it a taste. Right, most importantly, the hop tops have cooked nice and tender, so it didn't go all stringy when I tried to cut it. Anyway, let's have a taste. Okay, really good. Really savoury for a vegetable. I know it's got cheese and egg and stuff in there, but really, yeah, really savoury for a vegetable. It's got a very, very slight and mild gingery, spicy, citrusy sort of note to it, which I assume is just because the whole hop plant does that kind of thing. Because of the longer cooking inside the quiche as well as steaming beforehand, there's not now a trace of that kind of weird bristliness that you get with the hop tops. That's a really tasty and satisfying quiche. Now I think about it, I can't taste the sorrel in there at all. I think I'd probably have had to put more sorrel in there to get any kind of flavour coming through. Let me see if I can, with a bit of concentration, taste the sorrel. Maybe a slight background acidity, but I might be imagining it. That might be kind of wishful thinking. So yeah, really happy with that hop top quiche. And I think that'll be just as nice cold. I think a slice of that cold tomorrow, out on a long walk with the dog or a picnic or something, will be just as nice. I've been out foraging and I've picked some lovely wild garlic. This is Ramson's. This has been on the windowsill just overnight in a pint glass of water. I've also got some lovely stinging nettles. Stinging nettles, one of the most delicious wild vegetables actually, and really nutritious, and they don't sting when you eat them because cooking destroys the sting. I'm going to revisit something I've tried to make several times before, which is a kind of substitute for black pudding. So we're going to try to make something that's made of vegetables, but could take a place on a plate of cooked breakfast. In the past, I've tried to make it look a bit like black pudding. I think this time we'll just embrace the fact that this is going to be green, so we're going to make green pudding. Now I'm going to be kind of eyeballing the ingredient quantities today, but I will weigh them as I go, and then if this is a success, we'll know how to replicate it exactly, and if it's a failure, we might be able to figure out what we need to adjust. So, nettles, stinging nettles. I'm still using the gloves because at the moment these are still quite potent. I have 97 grams, so 100 grams of stinging nettles. That's unwashed weight, but I am going to wash those obviously, and then we'll blanch them, I think, just to make them easier to process. Now, interestingly, on my previous videos about stinging nettles, a lot of people have said, oh, underside of the leaves don't sting, or the stems don't sting, or whatever. In my experience, and this is probably the nettle species we've got here in the UK, every part of the plant stings. Even the roots, actually. If you're digging up and you touch the roots have got stinging hairs on them, in my experience. Other species of nettle, I think the one that grows in North America has fewer stings, and I think they might be only on the upper surface of the leaf and maybe just the ribs of the leaves or something like that. But anyway, stinging nettles in the UK, stings all over. The sting, for me, is not as serious as, for example, a wasp sting, so I'm not too worried about it. It causes a slight rash for me, other people more sensitive than me. So I do tend to use gloves because it's uncomfortable for several hours if you get stung by one of these things. I picked these from our own little bit of woodland, so I know more or less what's likely to be on them. I didn't pick the ones from directly underneath the rookery because the rooks are producing quite a lot of waste at the moment. But I do know that these are fairly clean to begin with. So I'm just going to give them a rinse like that and off to drain. Most of what I'm concerned about rinsing off here is any little bits of grit or mud that might have splashed up onto them, which might make the eating experience less pleasant. And then I'm going to leave them to drain because there's another ingredient that I need to go and get. Now, just to blanch these nettles and make them easy to handle and also destroy the stings, I'm just going to pour a kettle of boiling water over them. And this boiling water will ever so lightly cook them. which will destroy their capability to sting, but it also makes them just a bit easier to handle. They'll mush down a bit more easily. Now, if I wanted to freeze those for use later in the year when nettles aren't so good and fresh, I could just pack them down into little pots, put them in the freezer, and they would freeze really nicely now they've been blanched. Continuing the green theme, I've got some pumpkin seeds here, and there are several reasons for adding these. One is that they are 48% fat, and fat's not a bad thing to have in here. They are also 24% protein, which is really good. But chiefly, I know that pumpkin seeds, when they're cooked, when they're blended down and then cooked, they kind of seize up a bit like egg, and so that will help to bind my green pudding together. So I'm going to have one of these cups of pumpkin seeds. This is a drinking glass, but it's more or less a standard cup. That's about 150 grams of pumpkin seeds. So my blanched and mostly drained nettles are going to go in the food processor. I'm going to want some of this wild garlic, but again, I'm not really sure what weight of wild garlic I want, so I'm going to eyeball the quantity and then tell you the weight. So I reckon I want a nice bunch like that, which is, oh, it's about 100 grams. And that's already had a nice thorough rinse just after I picked it, before I stood it in water overnight. But to make it a little bit better behaved in the food processor, I'm just going to cut it into like 2 or 3 centimetre slices, just really so it doesn't wrap itself around the blade. And that can go into the food processor. It's going to look really full. Lid on, and we'll blend that until it chops down a little bit. Well, that didn't take long. Now I need to put some seasoning in there. I was going to say a big pinch of salt, but actually I've got this truffle marmite, so I'm going to have a nice generous spoonful. So that's going to give me the salt, but it's also going to give me a whole load of glutamates, and of course it's got the truffle flavour in it as well, so it's that kind of mushroomy vibe. And some herbs. I've got about half a teaspoonful of oregano. And spices, because this is kind of a sausagey thing, I'm going to go for white pepper. White pepper is a common spice used in sausages in the UK. So about half a teaspoonful of white pepper. And about half a teaspoonful of ground mace. Mace is the kind of cousin of nutmeg. It comes from the same plant, same fruit, it's a different part of the thing. Quite similar flavour to nutmeg, but subtly different. So I've got a cup of oats, and again, weirdly, that's 100 grams. So about half of those are going to go in with the nettles and wild garlic at this stage. I'll reserve the other half, and I'm just going to give that another blend. So out into a big bowl, lots of elbow room for mixing it up. My pumpkin seeds into the jug of my handheld blender with an equal quantity of water. That is equal by volume, which is 200 grams or 200 ml of water. And we'll start with that. Right, a bit more water, I think. About another 50 ml of water in there because it was starting to get a bit too thick. Right, I'm going to stop there. We're not anywhere near the kind of consistency of plant milk. We've got more like plant sludge, but I think that'll be okay. So that is going to go into there, if it will. This is where it's going to start looking a bit like cement. And we'll give that a bit of a mix and see what sort of consistency we've got. It's quite wet at the moment, but I've still got some oats left. Yeah, so my other 50 grams of oats. And that is my green pudding mix. Now, I think before I do anything else with this, so I'm just going to cover that up, leave it for half an hour, let those oats hydrate a bit. So if this was a sausage meat mix with meat in it, what we would normally do at this stage is fry a little bit and then taste it, just to see if we got the seasoning right and adjust for any other things. And we can do exactly the same with this. So it did firm up as it cooked, and well, time to give it a little taste. Okay, I think it needs a bit more salt, and I think it just needs something else as well, but we're not far off. So we'll have about a teaspoonful of additional salt and about a teaspoon of smoked paprika. I need to go careful here because obviously that's not green and I want to make green pudding. But once it's dispersed in, it's not going to colour it too much. Now, black pudding is normally stuffed into casings and then boiled before it's then sliced and fried. I don't have any casings to put this into, and I'm thinking about what I could do instead. So this is my other ingredient, or ingredient, since it's also green. Broadleaf dock leaves. Look at these, they're magnificent, aren't they? I went out and picked these just now, and they are starting to wilt a little bit. I was very careful not to pick snails and stink bugs, which were busy doing whatever stink bugs do. Looks like making more stink bugs, actually. Anyway, these dock leaves, I had in mind that I was going to kind of wrap up little parcels of that mixture and cook them like tamales or moi moi, kind of steam them in these leaves. But I'm not sure that's going to wrap very well. But I am going to use these leaves because they are delicious. I've just tasted, actually, just had a little chew on the stem. The stem is actually quite fibrous, but I'm just going to have a chew on there. Slightly acidic, ever so slightly fruity. I always thought dock would be just kind of inedibly bitter or something like that, but actually it's a tasty vegetable, so I might be eating some more of this later. Maybe cut the midribs off and steam those or something. Anyway, but I'm going to use these leaves, but not in the way I originally intended. Okay, here's the plan. A little bit of oil, and I'll brush that around this pudding basin. This is a pudding basin. This is specifically designed for sitting in water and cooking a pudding. See, it's got these little cutouts here at the bottom rim. And that's to allow bubbles of steam to escape as it sits in water. At least I think that's what they're for. My dock leaves I'm going to put in like that. Just kind of arrange them round. Alright, pretty good. Next, my pudding mixture, which hasn't firmed up as much as I thought it would, but never mind. It will when it's cooked. I think that's going to fit just nicely, actually. Almost as if I planned it. Pretty good. Now, as it steams, that will puff up a little bit. It will rise. So it's well that we've got a little bit of gap there for expansion. And I'm just going to cut these leaves so they don't go too far across. Now I'm going to cover that with foil, but first parchment. Parchment keeps the foil off the food and avoids any kind of chemical reactions that might be undesirable. Now if that was full up to the brim inside there, we'd put a pleat in that foil and paper, but I'm not going to bother because it's got some headspace in there anyway. $500ml of water in the pressure cooker, that should be enough. In that goes directly on the bottom. I would have liked to have put that on a rack so it doesn't rattle and bump about, but there's not enough headspace. It would, if I put it on the rack, it would. There's a little probe thing here which would pierce the top of that foil. Anyway, I'm going to put that on for an hour. All right, that's finished now. Let's get that out of there. Hot, very hot. Now I'm curious to know what's going on inside of here, but I think we'll let it cool down a little bit before we touch it. You can see that foil has gone kind of whitish in colour, and that's the reason I put the parchment on. The parchment protects the pudding from the foil protects the parchment from the moisture. Right, this should have cooled now sufficiently to handle it without hurting myself. Have we got green pudding? Not that green. Well, it came out okay. That looks interesting, doesn't it? Okay, well, green pudding, there it is. It might look a bit weird at the moment, but think about stuffed vine leaves. I think that doesn't look any less or more appetizing than stuffed vine leaves. I'm gonna let this cool completely, and then tomorrow for breakfast I'm gonna slice some and fry it up. It smells really appetizing. So it's the following day, and I've chilled this overnight, just ready to firm it up, hopefully. Yep, that's a lot firmer, so that we can take a slice of this and then fry it. So green pudding, it's quite solid, slightly sort of bouncy texture, which I think is the pumpkin seeds. I got the idea of using pumpkin seeds from Mary's Test Kitchen, where they made a kind of tofu from pumpkin seeds, which was surprising because it didn't require any chemicals to make it coagulate. It wasn't so surprising to me though, because it put me immediately in mind of a Nigerian dish called egusi, which I see my friend Babatunde make. Egusi is melon seed soup, and the ground melon seeds are kind of boiled, and when they're boiled they seize up into chunks, a lot like tofu or egg white. That's probably enough waffle. I'm going to cut a thickish slice of this, and I'm going to fry that and see what it comes out like. Now I thought it might be quite fun to do a nutrition analysis on this, so I've measured all the ingredients going in. I know the weight of the full pudding and I know the weight of this portion, so I should be able to calculate the nutrition for this slice. Okay, and my green pudding, which I've cut into 2 pieces just to make it manageable for flipping. Right, I'll turn that down and fry that gently. Okay, well it's only been in there about 3 minutes, but it already smells quite breakfasty. I'm just watching the edge here, which is what I do when I cook black pudding, because we'll see the kind of heat transforming it as it moves up through the product. So I'm just watching the edge, and once I see the kind of cooked portion get to the middle, I'll give them a flip. Meanwhile, I've got this beautiful tomato, which is going to go in there cut side down to start with. And what I'm going to do is take advantage of the fact that my cooker is ever so slightly on a slant. Oh, that was a double yolked egg. And I broke one of them. Well, bit of a weird breakfast, but I'm really looking forward to trying this stuff. So much so, in fact, I think that's going to happen here in the kitchen rather than at the dining table. So it cuts, it's a little bit softer than black pudding. I mean, I will keep on comparing it to black pudding because that's the kind of analogue we're going for here. So definitely a bit softer. But what does it taste like? Texture's interesting because it's actually quite moist and soft inside. It tastes good. I'm going to put some more pepper on there. And a little bit more salt. It doesn't taste really anything like I expected. It's good, but it's a thing in its own right. Let me try and describe the flavour. Really lovely green herb flavour, which is nice. I think it probably could have stood some more spice in there. Texture, well, texture is really interesting because those little bits of pumpkin seed, there's no grittiness to them at all. It's almost like little bits of egg white. Okay. So in combination with other breakfasty things, it's really good. So as a kind of culinary experiment, I'm quite happy with that. I think there's some work to do on the texture because it's just a little bit moist and soft. Maybe a little bit less liquid. Flavour's great. The wild garlic is quite mild, as always with ramsons. It always seems to be quite mild. You can taste the nettles, and I'm still struggling to describe the taste of nettles. It's something like asparagus or artichokes. It's kind of expensive green vegetable flavour. And you can actually really kind of taste the oats as well. Not just as a texture, but it's got a kind of slightly sweet porridginess to it, which is interesting, and not sure exactly that fits. As I say, I think it could stand a bit more spice, maybe a little bit of ginger. Overall though, I'm quite happy with that as a first attempt. It definitely earns its place on the plate. So that was my attempt at making something which I'm going to call green pudding. I'll be completely honest, I would not choose that over black pudding on a fried breakfast. It doesn't compete with black pudding as it stands at the moment. However, I do think this has got potential for further development. I'm not quite sure what to do. I need to go away and digest that mentally as well as physically. And then maybe we'll do another version of this at some point in the future. That might be next year because the wild garlic and nettles might be gone before I finish my ruminations. Anyway, that's green pudding. I hope that was interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.